to be here, just because what you all are doing in practice, focusing on details, is a spiritual truth of our country.
You know, we can be Democrats and Republicans, but most Americans are patriots.
For over a decade now, good ideas have emanated from the BPC.
Thank you for convening this very impressive group of thought leaders.
Your organization has brought together leaders from across our society to advocate for common sense solutions to our most challenging problems.
Because if it's bipartisan, it's much more likely to pass.
When you have people philosophically and ideologically in two different worlds, and they put them together on a committee, that committee usually is not very productive. Once we get staffs blending, and John and I, they know that the members are friends and we talk, things can happen.
Thank you, Anand, for that introduction, and to the BPC for its important efforts.
Thank the Bipartisan Policy Center. You guys are great.
We all have bipartisan responsibilities to this nation, to defend principles that have long made America the beacon of hope.
It's going to take all of us to try to turn down the temperature and really focus on what unites us.
Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining us for this afternoon's event. My name is Michelle Mellenbach. I am the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives, and I'm going to guide you through the next hour or so. So as you all know, ESG is dominating today's news cycle. Rapid politicization around what it means, its factors, and recent actions by state leaders and active rulemakings by the SEC have brought a good deal of uncertainty to the world of fund management and corporate strategy. We all know that ESG can be a very complex issue, in no small part because those three letters refer to an enormous amount of information, including corporate board governance, employee compensation and benefits, emissions data, and so much more. Each issue packed into ESG has its own jargon, academic research, data, and metrics. Here at the BPC, we've been working to explore the increasingly heated rhetoric around ESG and recent actions of state and federal policymakers around the nation to understand what they mean for American workers, retirees, and investors, corporations and communities, and of course, the next Congress. So where do we go from here? We have a great webinar for y'all today. In a few moments, U.S. Representative Bill Huizenga of Michigan will join BPC Senior Advisor Tim Doyle to share insights into where he sees the debate headed with a Republican House come January. Following our conversation, I will be joined by leading policy and academic minds on ESG to outline why and how the debate has evolved to what it is today, and where consensus can exist between business and lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats, as we set our sights on a new Congress. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to my colleague, Tim Doyle and Representative Huizenga.
Good afternoon and welcome to another segment of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Corporate Governance and ESG program. I'm Tim Doyle, Senior Advisor here at BPC, and have the distinct pleasure today of introducing Congressman Bill Huizenga, representing the newly drawn 4th District in the great state of Michigan. Congressman Huizenga sits on the House Financial Services Committee and has been ranking Republican on the Capital Markets Subcommittee for the past 6 years. As such, he is no stranger to the ESG debate. Welcome, Congressman, and congratulations on your recent election.
Tim, I appreciate it. Good to be with you again.
Congressman, if it's okay with you, I think we can just jump right in. I think what many people that have been watching our program regarding the ESG debate is they're really wondering what the Republicans are going to do in response now that they will be taking over Congress and importantly taking over the committee chairmanship. How do you think congressional Republicans will respond?
Well, we are going to be responding robustly. Chair Gensler has proposed 30 rules over the last 11 months, which is just a deluge, a flood of new rules that are coming in, proposed rules, obviously specifically on ESG. That is a huge monumental shift from what the SEC has done previously and historically, and by legal definition, what it has done. Now, here's part of the challenge with this. It has literally been over a year. It was in October of last year was the last time Gary Gensler formally appeared before our committee. And that is a problem for me. He has not made his directors available. We've had very few of them come. And in the case, we had Director Graywall who came, his director of enforcement, whose basic three answers were, I can't answer that because it might become a case. I can't answer that because we're in the middle of a investigation, and I can't answer that because we had an investigation and we can't comment on it. There was just very obviously, I'm being slightly sarcastic on that, but there was just very, very little information. And in fact, informally, we were told later by some of our friends on the other side who were also a bit frustrated that they had heard that that was the coaching method. It was just stall, don't answer, just kind of put it off. We'll get back to you was the most common answer. And frankly, that hasn't happened. So there is a problem that needs to get addressed. And that is going to take oversight. And frankly, Chair Waters hasn't been interested in functioning in that oversight capacity, certainly when it comes to the SEC.
Right. And one of the things regarding coordination is in the last, we'll call it 6 months, maybe 9 months, there has been a lot of attention and focus from individual states on the ESG issue, both red states and blue states. Red states coming out and attacking ESG at a number of different levels, and blue states coming out and supporting ESG at a number of different levels. Given the significance of state corporate law and the broader, broader SEC and corporations agenda, how will that impact Congress?
Yeah. Well, very good question. And as you are getting into this, it is the complication. New York financial regulators have an outsized impact on financial regulation. Delaware corporate law has an outsized footprint on corporate law here in the U.S. Those kinds of things will be added to it. I think, though, one of the most important rulings that we've seen come out of the Supreme Court recently was the West Virginia versus EPA case. Taking a look at what the Chevron doctrine really means, where is that boundary between reasonable, which is the language that is used, the reasonableness of interpretation, and that overinterpretation, that literally making up out of whole cloth a direction that a bureaucracy or a department wants to go, regardless of the merits of it. And I'm sorry that democracy is not always an efficient means of delivering government, but it was intended to be that way, right? It was intended to have a House and a Senate that would be in conflict at times, and with their policy views, and certainly with jointly us having the legislative branch versus the executive branch on those things. It was meant to have this healthy tension when we look at how our founders put it together. So, I believe we need to look at what is happening with corporate law. We've had some of these conversations, and I know, Tim, you're originally from Michigan as well, like me. The automotive capital of the world, well, it's been frankly dictated by California's CAFE standards, and what has been the requirements out in California. We're seeing that sort of forced movement towards EVs and those kinds of things. So we've got a lot of issues around the country that are in this healthy tension right now.
But another issue I wanted to talk to you about, one that's near and dear to us here at Bipartisan Policy Center. We've written on it, had a number of events on it. And recently, and that is the idea of materiality. And I know recently you signed on with, I believe it was Congressman Barr, to a bill. I was going to say it's a mandatory materiality requirement act of 2022. I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about that bill and what you hope to accomplish by it.
Yeah. Well, my background's actually real estate, and as they say in real estate, what are the three most important things? Location, 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 right? Well, I would say the exact same thing with this. When it comes to business regulation, it's materiality, materiality, materiality. Those have to be the watchwords. And again, what we've been trying to say is let's have the debate about the materiality of the information that you're looking for. And in this case, it's the SEC reaching into every publicly traded company, which also, though, is frankly reaching into non-public companies and literally forcing them to put information out that might be proprietary, it might be some commercial advantage that they have, or they may not have the ability to go and do that. Think again of that small family farm. I and Congressman Barr, Andy Barr from Kentucky, who is my seatmate on financial services, we sit next to each other and work very closely, very closely on a number of issues. This is saying that you cannot require a new regulation without the materiality element of this being addressed. In other words, you can't just say, well, we would just like to know. That is not the intent. This is not how the system is supposed to work. And specifically when it comes to investing, the materiality question is very relevant based on your investments and how you are investing. That really should reign supreme. You know, what is it that is the information that affects your operation as a business and by extension your profitability and your viability moving forward? And you know, again, you've got the SEC that is there for investor protection, but it's also there for capital formation. That's one of the other main goals and objectives. In other words, we want healthy companies moving forward. And again, going back to some of the earliest financial regulations that we have had, materiality has always been that watchword. Is it going to adversely or positively affect the performance of a company that you may be an investor in? And that, you know, again, it's not real popular these days. Everyone wants to reimagine capitalism and kind of rethink what a profit motive might be. But at the end of the day, companies that have shareholders are there to operate to the benefit of the shareholder. Now, do we want that to be an extension and make society a better place and all those things? Absolutely. But you do that through offering those products, and that instead of the government coming in and arbitrarily deciding who is or isn't, you know, being a benefit to society. You know, by the way, FTX's score when it came to the environment, off the charts. Guess what? That fraud. And it appears that it is fraud. I like to say it looks like Enron met Bernie Madoff and had a baby named Sam Bankman-Fried. And you know, there's so it doesn't matter what your environmental ESG score is. You just did serious damage to the system. And again, we have to look at the materiality of the information that's being demanded.
Yeah, and I know the Supreme Court, that is, looked at materiality in the sense of a balancing act, and it's whether a reasonable investor would find the information determinative, either a lack thereof or the information, in making reasonable investment decisions. So you get us lawyers like to talk about that reasonableness standard. It gets very subjective, and it makes it.
I haven't met many reasonable attorneys, Tim, but yes.
Maybe I'm the only one, but so just so people are clear, what you're talking about doing is codifying the Supreme Court's definition of materiality that has historically been used at the SEC. However, of late, and people have argued in the current climate disclosure bill, they kind of are changing the edges of what materiality is. Is that fair to say?
I would argue that they're more than kind of changing. They are redefining, and that is exactly why we have to apparently codify something that had been accepted corporate law and had been accepted practice both by the regulators and those that they are regulating. So now you've got those who they are regulating, think these companies, they're running around trying to figure out what exactly does it mean, and they can't get a clear answer. And so it's really not just the regulation itself; it's the threat of regulation that has radically changed business behavior. And I would argue not always for the good. Again, we're back to the materiality of what is the materiality of the information that you are requesting. And people might want to know a lot about me, right? And what's my favorite pizza topping? Is that material as to whether I appear here today or not? No, it's not really material. Now, if you're the Cattlemen's Association, you might want to know whether I'm a vegan or not.
maybe
and
so. Right.
That might be material, and it's those kinds of judgments that we have to go through. And apparently, we need to help the regulators clarify that and understand what exactly their role is.
Congressman, I thank you again. I really appreciate your time today for giving us a preview of undoubtedly what's going to be a vigorous debate in Congress. Obviously, here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we look for areas of bipartisanship, and both this conversation and others we've had, we believe that there is some, but there will clearly be some core decisions that have to be made, some core arguments that will have to be brought to the table. So thank you again. I'm Tim Doyle, Senior Advisor here at BPC. I have the pleasure now of turning the program over to my colleague, Michelle Nellenbach. For those watching online, I wanted to thank you again for supporting BPC and wish you all a wonderful holiday season. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim and Congressman Huizenga. That was gave us all a really good sense of where the politics are around ESG and some of what we might expect from the Republicans starting in January when they do retake the House. I am really honored to be able to introduce now our panel. You can get more information about their bios on our website, but I'll just run through this real quickly. Bob Eccles is a visiting professor of management practice at the University of Oxford. He is the founding chairman of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and one of the founders of the International Integrated Reporting Council. Dan Crowley is a partner in the K&L Gates firm's Washington, D.C. office. His practice is focused on public policy issues relating to financial services and capital markets, and he leads the firm's global financial services policy practice. And Aaron Shapiro is the head of retirement studies and public policy with Morningstar Investment Management, LLC, and Morningstar Incorporated. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. So we're just going to dive right into this. I'm going to start with Bob. Okay. So you're widely seen as one of the godfathers of ESG, which is typically dated to have originated sometime around 2004. Yet you've been working on corporate sustainability issues for much longer than that. Can you briefly lay out for us a short history of ESG and how we arrived at today's moment?
So could I do something a little different and respond directly to Representative Huizenga's video?
Go for it.
I thought it was excellent. I'm like sitting here going, of course, it's about materiality. You mentioned the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. For people who don't know it, I was the founding chair. Rogers was the founder. Janine Guglio did great work. We said, look, we're looking at what information in the so-called ESG domain matters to shareholder value creation, created 11 sectors, 77 industries, very disciplined industry working groups, companies, investors, and said, well, what matters? And it matters by industry. So safety in clinical trials matters to value creation in a pharmaceutical company. You know, it obviously doesn't in a bank. There's 26 high-level issues, about 5 or 6 on average apply. So when Representative Huizenga was talking, I was thinking, that's exactly the conversation we should be having. He's got colleagues in his party who aren't talking about materiality at all. You have former Vice President Pence calling ESG this pernicious strategy of the left. It's its progressive agenda to impose social values in ways that they couldn't get, through legislation. What these red states are doing by excluding companies that they say aren't fossil fuel friendly when they have big shares of, fossil fuels. It's like, that's a conversation that makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to me. It has nothing to do with what Representative Huizenga was talking about. So if we have hearings in Congress with the House and the focus is materiality, as opposed to some definition out of the blue that's been put on ESG, which it never had, I think that would be very constructive. I think about ESG as material risk factors for value creation. So Representative Huizenga and I have no difference in view at all about the definition. We may disagree on whether something is material or not, like carbon emissions. And as he said, that's a useful debate to have. So I loved his video.
Well, that's great to hear. Okay. Well, Dan, let me go to you because I know you and Bob have written a fair amount about this together. Do you have any thoughts on either what the congressman said or Bob's reaction to it?
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you for having this discussion. I think the debate on ESG has become highly polarized, and particularly given the composition of the Congress starting in January, the only way forward is bipartisanship. So I really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion before the Congress even begins. But let me just echo what Bob said. I took very careful notes of Congressman Huizenga's comments, and I agree with everything he said. The question is, where do we go from here in terms of divining what is material to investors? And I like the formulation that former SEC Chair Mary Jo White used to use, which is materiality goes to what investors need to have, not necessarily what they would like to have. And that goes to the point Bob was making. Here's the thing about sustainability generally and ESG in particular, is that it has been evolving for 20 years. The Europeans are 3 or 4 years ahead of us. But most of the American companies, certainly the Fortune 500 companies, have already gone out into the marketplace with disclosures geared at sustainability, ESG. The problem for investors is that they're not standardized and therefore they're not comparable. So we've got people putting out information, trying to give investors information about material risk factors, which do differ by company and by industry. But there's no way for investors to take that data currently and analyze it. And so I think in that sense, the SEC really is, if anything, behind the curve. They're not driving the sustainability agenda. They're playing catch up. And I think as Congress engages in the oversight process, it's going to be really important to ask what's going on in the market now and how are we going to improve on that for the benefit of investors. I think that would be a much more productive discussion than trying to go back and figure out who's right and who's wrong on ESG, because at the end of the day, those are political talking points. But the SEC in its regulatory capacity needs to come up with actual regulations that companies are going to be expected to comply with. And that's going to require an informed discussion on the record where we have exploration of exactly what materiality means. And then how does that translate into what information investors are provided. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the background on why all this is necessary, but I don't want to take up more time now, so we'll come back to you.
Great. Well, we got both of you to agree with the congressman, so maybe we've solved all this here. But I think there's probably a little bit more to dive into, because the interesting thing is, I think, a year ago, ESG was really a conversation among boardrooms and around the SEC, and now with some actions by state governors and some members of Congress, it really has become a political football, and that's going to make it very hard for the SEC to come out with regulation to try and find a middle ground here and to lower the temperature, which I think what we're trying to do here at the BPC. I want to get Aaron in here. We've just talked a lot about the politics. Our sense at BPC is that a lot of your average Americans and retail investors have no idea what this conversation is about. They just want a clean environment. They want their investments to earn interest. They want to make some money. So does that align with your experience at Morningside? Do you think it's the understanding of ESG is widespread? And how, if more understanding is needed, should ESG be explained to retail investors?
Well, let me start by saying I think there are a bunch of different types of investors out there. So the first thing is there's a subset of investors who are very interested in ESG, and I think we can infer they have a pretty good idea of what's going on. And they're actively seeking out ESG funds. So sustainable funds attracted around 69 billion in flows at the close of 2021. We'll get 2022 numbers soon, and closed the year with $357 billion, which was 4 times what they had in 2018. Okay, so there are a group of people who are really interested in this. And that's really important because I think anything you can do to engage people, give them choice around their investing is likely to help them save more money, whether that's in the context of retirement plan or for something else. Outside of that subset, I think it's probably fair to say that both ordinary investors and indeed the people who provide advice or make funds available, retirement plan sponsors, financial advisors, probably have an uneven understanding. We certainly work with people who have been very excited to introduce more ESG options, say into retirement plans. We're waiting around for the Department of Labor to clarify their guidance, which they recently did, and we think we'll start seeing some movement there. But I think BPC's understanding is probably right for a lot of people. That said, and I want to pick up on something that Dan alluded to. The interest in ESG is very much an investor-led thing, just coming from institutional investors. And with the caveat that there's probably some, range or sampling bias given the people that we work with, my impression is that institutional investors often have very sophisticated views of how they want to manage, particularly ESG risks, and are quite sophisticated in assimilating this information, often have their own custom models. This is becoming really mainstream. And that's because they're really interested in not being, just price takers on what other people think of ESG risks, but making their own assessments. And in terms of improving understanding, I think it would be really helpful to have a framework, particularly for 40 Act mutual funds, that most ordinary investors are accessing, that are very clear about what is meant by ESG in the context of a fund strategy. So, for example, does this fund do negative screening, which is what a lot of funds do, and try to avoid controversial companies? Does this fund have a particular impact goal, and if so, how do they measure whether they are achieving that goal? Does this fund simply seek to manage and mitigate ESG risks? And an investor investing in that kind of fund, could expect to get a very different weighting towards securities than one that has active negative screening or won't invest in certain kinds of companies. And I think, you can glean that information from the prospectuses, but having more standardization would be helpful. The SEC proposed rulemaking on this. They got a lot of comments. I think it's a hard task, but it's definitely an achievable one. And so I'm hopeful that we'll get those kind of disclosures in the near future. And I think that will really help retail investors.
Great, thank you. I think that would be quite helpful if we could have some sort of standardization here. I do want to come right back to Aaron with another one. So many of the research studies of ESG purport to find a link between ESG strategies and investment returns. So doing well by doing good, as it were. Other studies fail to find such a link. And I think that is part of why we have this political issue here, is there is not terribly certain. So is this simply a contest of research methodologies, or is there something else? What has Morningstar found in its research, and how do you make sense of those competing findings?
Yeah, so the really simple answer is that any of these kind of return studies are going to be determined somewhat by the time period that we're in. It is the case that at least through 2021, sustainable funds, at least in our sustainable fund landscape report, had tended to, on average, outperform conventional funds. Not every single one outperformed, but you were more likely to get outperformance. That makes a lot of sense. These funds, tended to be a little bit heavy towards tech. Usually they were a little bit light on energy, and those strategies just did very well. We'll see what happens going forward. The other differences in definition, and I'll give you an example. There was a pretty influential study that looked at the CAFRs for state pension plans and concluded that ones that had an ESG mandate did worse. I was curious about this, so I went and recoded just for pension plans that were signatories to the Principles for Responsible Investing, and then I controlled for their asset allocation, just as the original study authors did. And I didn't find any difference over the same time period between returns. So, some of it just depends on the definition you're using. But this all builds up to a really important point I want to make, and maybe the most important thing I have to say in this conversation. The impact on ESG investing is on investing returns is really a question that can have no definitive answer. And I don't mean for that to sound wishy-washy, but look, at some points in time, good ESG companies, however defined, are going to be relatively cheap as a group. And at some point, they're going to be more expensive as a group, right? That premium is just going to change, and sometimes they'll be at a discount, sometimes they'll be at a premium. So I don't think it makes sense to assume there is some immutable, permanent, one-to-one correspondence between ESG investing returns that would hold for all market environments. This is definitionally has to depend on relative valuations, particularly as this becomes more mainstream. Now, that's not to say that you should ignore ESG or ESG risk in particular, because if you do that, you're simply a price taker on what the rest of the market thinks. So that's its own kind of decision. But it's not to say that this question isn't important to keep looking at and studying, and different people are going to have different opinions. But I don't think it makes sense to say there's some immutable one-to-one correspondence that can forever be true. It's going to depend on the market environment.
Michelle, could I build a little bit on what Aaron said? Do you mind?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you or Dan to do that.
Thank you. I'll go first and I'll be quick and I'll turn it over to my friend Dan. So, when Aaron was talking and he said, well, some periods ESG stocks may perform better, maybe less. I'm not an investor like Aaron. What came to my mind was value versus growth stocks, right? There's sector rotations. And so, it sounds like there's an analogy that Aaron was referring to. Notice the language that he used, ESG risk factors. I think we need to directly deal with the language and the ideological component. Look, I'm to the left of the Representative Huizenga, but there's people way to the left of me. They don't like ESG because it's only about companies making money, not making the world a better place. And the way you phrase this, doing well by doing good, I think that's part of the confounding. ESG is not impact. ESG is material risk factors in a company's operations and activities. Doing well on those means you're not making the world a worse place. You're not necessarily making the world a better place, because that's the positive and negative externalities of companies' products and services, and that's impact. And I think one of the reasons that we're in the place we are today is there was just outlandish claims that were being made. And we went from ESG is bad to ESG can make you more money to ESG can make you more money and save the world. As you said, okay, so, you don't have any oil and gas stocks and you got a bunch of FANGs and they've got low carbon emissions. That doesn't have anything to do with dealing with climate change. And so I think we need clarity on that, as Aaron was talking about. One more point that gets to both the substance and the ideology, a term that Representative Huizenga didn't use, but is directly related to materiality, is fiduciary duty. The fiduciary duty of a company board directors, the fiduciary duty of people in the funds. And this is where you see the kind of ideological debate playing out, I think, in some interesting and unfortunate ways, because if you look what Ron DeSantis has done, and he has that law and, pecuniary factors, the way Aaron is talking about it, of course, these are pecuniary factors, they're industry specific, they're not trying to save the world. And so you've got this debate about the people that call ESG material risk factors say, you would be violating your fiduciary duty if you didn't take that to account. If you choose to define ESG as a pernicious strategy of the radical left or whatever you want to call it, and it's violating fiduciary duty, call it that, and then you can make the claim that it's violating fiduciary duty. Why I liked Representative Huygens' comments so much, and I hope when we have these hearings, let's not go have an ideological debate about ESG that people can define however they wanted to. Let's talk about materiality. Let's talk about fiduciary duty. Those both are completely bipartisan, and I think that's a great way forward.
Great, thanks. Dan, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, as usual, I agree with Bob. I have a different sort of take on it as a free market Republican and how I get to the same place Bob is. But let me talk a little bit. One of the benefits about talking about ESG is also clarifying what it is not. And many people on my side of the aisle will say, well, if it's material, it'll end up in the financial. And I think that that's correct. But it's really important to distinguish between audited financial statements on the one hand prepared according to GAAP versus sustainability disclosures on the other hand. And the reason that's important is that audited financials are a historical snapshot of actual economic reality. Sustainability disclosures, on the other hand, are forward-looking, prospective in nature about what might happen. They're also very important, but it's also important not to conflate the two. So having put that issue on the table, let me say that the way I look at sustainability is from the standpoint of America first, if you will. What makes American capital markets the envy of the world? Why do we have the deepest, most liquid, most robust capital markets anywhere in the world? And I would submit, after decades of studying these issues, that it boils down to 4 factors. 1 is transparency. 2 is innovation. 3 is respect for private property rights. And number 4 is the legal system that gives you the ability to enforce property rights. Of those 4, transparency is the most important. Our entire corporate disclosure system since the 1930 Securities Act has been based on this notion that investors require disclosure of material risk factors sufficient to be able to allocate scarce capital. One thing that is routinely overlooked in this debate, and again, many people on my side of the aisle equate ESG with the Green New Deal. They see it as thinly veiled Marxism and therefore the enemy that needs to be killed. Instead, I think if they were to look at it from the standpoint of our regulatory system that has evolved over the last 80, 90 years, and particularly in the last 2 decades since Enron and WorldCom, the creation of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, setting up independent funding for FASB and the PCAOB, in all of the things that have been done, I view sustainability and ESG disclosure as part of that stream, that evolution of policy. But the missing link, and the thing that my friends often overlook, is the one that Bob just nailed, which is the fiduciary duty. The people involved in selecting investments for many people, particularly in the retirement savings context, are fiduciaries, either because they're on a board that's overseeing a pension fund or because they're regulated by ERISA. And the best example of this is the extent to which the Trump administration went to try to put the toothpaste back into the tube on the DOL ESG standard. For the very first time, the Obama administration opened the door to considering ESG by planned fiduciaries. The Trump administration came in number one target, which to try to remedy that. They tried for 4 years. At the end of the 4th year, in October, they finally put out a set of principles that required that ESG factors relate to pecuniary returns. And it sounded like they'd solved the puzzle, except that pecuniary returns are implicit, were implicit, and are implicit now, even though the Biden administration has revisited it. And it's because that's required by ERISA. So the question becomes, what do fiduciaries need in order to assess material risk factors relating to the investments? And I would submit that that has a temporal dimension. What's material in the next calendar quarter or the next year can be very different than what is material over a 40-year investment horizon for pension funds, for example, that are saving for people entering the workforce today for their retirement 40 years ago. I don't know anybody that is not a complete climate change denier that would say climate change doesn't present a material risk over the next 40 years. So with that, I'll pause.
Well, that was really helpful, and I think gets to the issue we're having, which is the law and the history and the finances around this. They just don't align with the political conversation that's occurring. And so I want to turn to this article that you and that Dan and Bob co-wrote that talked about turning down the heat on the ESG debate. So Dan, I'm going to stick with you, and I'm going to ask all of our panelists later on about that general objective. But before that, can you expand on something that you and Bob also said in the article, which is the conflating of material risk disclosures wanted by investors and resisted by companies with related political issues is the primary reason for the heated political debate. Can we talk a little bit more about that, and how are we going to get past it?
Sure. Well, I'll try to be quick so we can hear from
you're good,
Bob and Aaron. But, from the Republican perspective, if you look at the Biden administration agenda. And by that, I mean the legacy items, the things that he is really focused on and the things he's going to be remembered for. They basically fall into two buckets. Climate change on the one hand, and this broad concept of social equity on the other. Those policy priorities are highly controversial and have attracted a lot of Republican response, particularly to the DE&I agenda, but no less so on the ESG agenda. My contention, though, is that they are conflating their dislike for the Biden policy priorities with ESG, and they're very different. I think as we get into these hearings, you're going to start to see that as we peel away the layers of the onion, that it really goes way beyond political talking points or trying to score social justice warrior points. Ultimately, it comes down to information that investors need in order to make informed decisions about how to allocate their scarce capital.
Michelle, could I ask Dan a question? Because I learned something from him that's important. There's a fun story how he and I came together on that article, which we don't have time for, but he and I go back many years. What I learned about you is how the Frank-Dodd bill got passed. And I think, the point, and I completely get it, is that in a lot of ways laid the seeds for how this has all become such a political issue. So maybe just share that with the audience.
Yeah, sure. Very quickly, up until Dodd-Frank, these were not partisan issues. The last major financial services bill was Sarbanes-Oxley. Sarbanes, a Democrat from Maryland, Oxley, a Republican from Ohio. That was the pattern throughout our history until the credit crisis of 08 and 09. And then what happened was the Democrats decided to revisit every financial services law from the 1864 National Bank Act through Sarbanes-Oxley in a 14-month period. And they simply didn't have time to take into consideration alternative views. And as a consequence, Republicans were left on the side of the road. That dynamic has never been ameliorated ever since then, because all of the rulemakings that flowed from Dodd-Frank were viewed as partisan. Republicans tried to undo Dodd-Frank. There has never been a reckoning, a bipartisan reckoning, that at the end of the day, these are not partisan issues. We're talking about American capital markets and the success that makes us the envy of the world and how we preserve that. That's how I look at these issues.
Well, I will just throw a plug in there that BPC has documented well over the years that really to have durable long-term policy, it has to be bipartisan, because when issues do come up, you can't just have one party owning it. They've really got to be locked in together. And so again, as we're looking at the next Congress, it would be hopeful that through conversations like this one and the work that the three of you are doing, that we can hopefully bring the Democratic Senate and the Republican House together to provide some clarity along the lines of what Aaron had articulated earlier. I don't know, Bob, if you want to comment at all on any of this.
Just to build quickly, I mean, both Aaron and Dan have made the point about standards. Just like you've got standards for financial reporting, you didn't always have them, so you can compare, revenues across, companies in the same industry and over time. We need standards for the sustainability reporting. And it's different the way Dan described. U.S. companies operate in a global context. His point about, why this is really critical to America. We do have the best, the deepest, most liquid capital markets in the world. Transparency is important. The SEC is working on its rule. There's something called the International Sustainability Standards Board. SASB basically merged into it. So it's interesting. It's the International Sustainability Standards Board and the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation. This is an American invention, SASB. And U.S. companies are going to be expected to report on things like climate because investors are global. They want to be able to compare the performance of companies. And so, as Dan said, they already are. I mean, the big oil and gas companies, they're reporting on carbon emissions. They don't have the standards yet. They're voluntarily giving, scope 1 and 2 target reduction deadlines. So a lot of the things that are very political, they're happening already, even in the oil and gas industry. So why are we doing this to ourselves, right? I mean, it's to the benefit of American companies that we sort of collaborate with the ISSB. We have a global baseline rather than talking about, okay, this is just a burden. We can have the cost benefit analysis. If we really want to help American companies compete in the global markets, we need to facilitate that by, essentially working with the ISSB, that we have a common baseline set of standards so that it's an even playing field for American companies competing against European and Asian ones.
Aaron, is there anything you want to add? I know you guys are having conversations up on the Hill, and I mean, how are you talking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of turning down the heat, there are a couple of observations I'd make. One is that the people really do start from a place of agreement, and it is around materiality, or in the case of ERISA, it's around ensuring that plans never subordinate the interest of participants to some other goal, right? So both the Trump administration's ESG rule and the current one start with that same preambulatory text where they're talking about you can never subordinate the interest of participants to some other goal, but then they differ on how ESG fits into that. So the one rule had a series of pretty difficult documentation requirements, had restrictions around qualified default investment alternatives, that were designed to and did have a chilling effect on the adoption of including ESG-oriented strategies in plans. But they do start with that common base. So that gives me some cause for optimism, because I think there is some sort of common understanding there. The second thing I would just observe is that one of the political narratives that's implicit in this is sort of ESG investing and this transparency could hurt certain industries, and I'd actually say I have the contrary view to that, which is that the more transparency there is, the easier it is for companies in industries that are going to face a lot of ESG risk to demonstrate how well they are managing that risk compared to peers. And that makes it much easier for investors to say, okay, instead of just throwing up my hands and saying I'm going to avoid this entire sub-industry, I'm going to look for best-in-class performers that might do the best at managing these risks. And so I actually think that this can help with capital flows and can again it's not a case of this kind of information resulting in people totally abandoning certain sectors or industries. And the third thing I'd say is I think that, and it's a theme that I've come back to, but I think promoting transparency and particularly enabling choice is really important in a context where basically every American has to invest for something: retirement, increasingly health savings accounts, 529s for their kids. Anything you can do to help people engage, think about their investments, even if they conclude, I don't want my investments to necessarily reflect my values, or I'm not that curious about ESG. You'll have people who say, actually, I'd like to have a report on how much ESG risk I have. I just want to see what it looks like and get a sense of where that comes from, and that can be very helpful. Because it's a lot less abstract to ordinary people than kind of traditional financial reporting. And I think that's a really useful tool that we have to engage people. And it's just really important to do that. So those are some areas where I think there could be bipartisan consensus.
Can we talk about one industry to sort of illustrate why having a bipartisan approach would be good? Oil and gas is, one of the industries that the anti-ESG crowd is concerned about, that it's somehow going to be hurting the ability of the American energy industry to pump oil. A lot is made about engine number one. Mike Pence called 3 environmentalists that were put on the board. There's 3 people with oil and gas experience, one of whom was the CEO of an oil and gas company who's a Republican. It's like, come on, Mike, I mean, we can disagree, but let's just get the facts straight, right? Here's another fact. ExxonMobil, I looked at them yesterday, their market cap is $426 billion. It's pretty much near its peak. It is doing share buybacks. It's increasing its share buybacks. It's not drilling for more oil. And here's where you get the irony on the left. Joe Biden's mad that they're not going out drilling for more oil and that they're doing the share buybacks. And it's like, if you'd have said that a year ago and he was encouraging ExxonMobil to drill for more oil, he would have been attacked on the left. And so you've got people attacking BlackRock because they think that they're, against the oil and gas industry. You've got people attacking BlackRock because they're supporting the oil and gas industry. These are just coming from different ideological spaces. Why don't we kind of talk about facts? Because they're there.
Now, Bob, if I could just add to that we're seeing an unfortunate dynamic where increasingly investors are viewed by politicians as pawns in policy discussions. And I really don't think that's fair. There are policy issues, and then there's investment, and they are fundamentally different. We get into trouble when we conflate them. But we're seeing it not just on ESG, we're seeing it in international affairs. Can you invest in China or Russia or whatever? I mean, we have developed over the last few years this habit or this pattern of identifying a policy challenge and then trying to figure out how we can use investors to meet the desired policy outcome. Investors are neutral, right? They're participants in the capital markets. The SEC role, I agree with you, is to protect investors, but it's also important to facilitate capital formation. And the single most important thing in capital formation is investor confidence, full stop. Without investor confidence, the whole thing unwinds. So I think we should be focusing the discussion on how to maintain investor confidence by providing relevant and material information, rather than trying to drag investors into what are essentially political debates.
So in terms, go ahead, Bob.
Just a quick case study. So there's a company that I just learned about, I wrote about, Dan knows, called Next Era Energy Resources. It's based in Florida, and kind of cute little fact, they qualify for the Point Bridge Put America First Fund MAGA, the MAGA ETF, because they give enough money to Republican PACs. So I guess it's a pretty Republican company. Their goal is to get America to net zero. They have fabulous reporting on sustainability. They talk about diversity and inclusion. The equity, no, that's a more complicated thing, as Dan has pointed out. I mean, that's where you're starting to get into, I think, the policy realm and the political realm. They've got a very nice sentence. They can't lead to the next era of energy without diversity. So diversity broadly defined, you know, the normal ways you would think about it in terms of gender and race, but also in kind of ways of thought. And so if you look at what companies are already doing, what I wonder is, what do they think of all this? I mean, they're not going to quit doing ESG. They call a report the ESG report. It's organized in terms of ESG. It's all very thoughtful. So if these hearings think they're going to somehow make companies, most of the, ire is being directed at investors for the wrong reasons. Do they think all these companies are going to quit producing sustainability reports? Are going to quit, dealing with climate change and diversity? Of course they aren't. It's just too much baked into how business is being done for value creation. So again, hats off to Representative Huizenga. If we can have the discussion around materiality and not, this kind of crazy ideological discussion that seems to be emerging from groups like, I'll just say it, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the State Financial Officers Foundation, some of that stuff is just kind of, nutso. And it's not helpful. It's not helpful.
Well, yeah, agreed. Thank you for that. And I think, so it does seem like, in terms of how we're going to bring down the heat on all of this, y'all are talking about better information, more data. I think, Aaron, to your point, if there's documentation on the extent to which investors are asking for this information about their portfolios and stuff, that would be helpful on the Hill. But I'm just wondering, like, who does that? How do we get that kind of information? And
well,
the SEC rulemaking going to drive that? What's the next step here?
Well, if I could just, offer, Bob is exactly right that these congressional hearings are an opportunity for a teachable moment. And I've been saying for months that as the hearings unfold, and keep in mind, there are multiple committees, different jurisdictions. The Judiciary committees are looking at antitrust issues. The Banking and Financial Services Committee are looking at other issues such as the ones we've been talking about. But at the end of the day, we need to get past the partisan divide in terms of sophistication, right? There are varying degrees of sophistication. If you look at some of the things coming out of the states, it's clear that we will need to educate people before we can argue with them. And one of the benefits of congressional hearings is that we get facts on the record and people start looking at what the real issues are. We get past the rhetoric. And I suspect strongly that as we get 6 to 9 months into hearings on ESG, eventually folks on the Hill will shift to lower hanging fruit, because when you really dig into these issues, when you really learn what they're all about, ultimately it comes down to capitalism and the players in the capital markets and the information they need to keep the capital markets functioning. The rest of it is politics or window dressing. It's interesting, but it's not fundamental to what's going on here.
I have been remiss in reminding our online viewers that they can do questions in the chat or on Twitter at BPC Live. I don't know if anyone wanted to comment, Bob or Aaron, on Dan's comments.
I just, I think, look, there's always going to be some political theater when you have hearings. I've watched them. I don't spend a lot of time, whether it's from the right or the left. But I think if the chairman of the committees that are calling the hearings do so in good faith, and they really do want to understand, what ESG is, and people have different points of view on it, and let's talk about materiality, let's talk about fiduciary duty, that it's a Republican, House, I think is actually quite beneficial. So a lot of turning down the heat is going to rest, on the shoulders of the people that are kind of holding these hearings, because they could do a lot to try and bring us together, or they can do a lot to just kind of inflame it more to play the crowd. And I obviously don't have any control over that. So if you folks know people down there in DC that can have some influence on the chairman of these committees that are, holding these hearings, that'd be swell.
Well, sadly, so much of the oversight today is political theater on both sides of the aisle, but hopefully perhaps they can come together and have really thoughtful, like Congressman Heising indicated, conversations about these issues instead of just kind of grandstanding, and we will do what we can there. I do want to now turn to a couple of questions we got from the audience. The first one is the E and the G are pretty well established, defined, and measurable. How do we create the same amount of rigor and objectivity with identifying relevant issues and manner for measuring and reporting on impact? Anyone want to tackle that one?
So I'll take it real quick. I mean, this is an example of where ESG and impact are different. So the question kind of confounds the two, because implicitly impact is an S. You can say an S. What is S? What's the analog to carbon emissions? Is it income inequality? Is it diversity, equity, inclusion? Is it the living wage? And I know the ISSB is looking into this. So what are the material social issues that matter to value creation? Are they general? Do they go according to particular industries? Impact exists in both the environmental and the social dimension. If you look at the case of carbon emissions, scope 1 and 2 is basically managing your operations. Scope 3 is where a lot of the impact comes from, and that's where a lot of the debate is. And so again, we need to distinguish between ESG as material risk factors to a company's operations and activities. Impact is the positive and negative externalities that a company is creating through its products and services that, are still operating with, kind of legal bounds. We need to get that analytically distinct.
I agree. And, on the S side, as I said, ESG is now being viewed through this prism of the Biden policy priorities. And his priorities are climate change and social equities. And you apply that to ESG, it means the E is about climate change, nothing else, right? We're not talking about plastics in the ocean and the impact that's going to have on fertility and all the other issues there are to talk about. In Washington, D.C. in 2022, the E means climate change. The S means human capital, and we're waiting for the SEC to issue their long-awaited human capital rulemaking based on a human capital petition. The issues are well known. There, on gender diversity, this is not a question of who is more woke. There is empirical evidence that suggests that having too much testosterone in the boardroom leads to undue risk-taking. And so corporations should be disclosing the composition of their boards. NASDAQ has said they should do it. The California Assembly has said they should do it. These policy developments in many ways are catching up to where the market already is. And by the way, the G in the current political vernacular really relates only to the proxy voting process and the manner in which shareholders communicate their preferences on major policy issues to corporations through the proxy voting process. Obviously, ESG is much broader than that, as Bob has been talking about with Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and so forth. And of course, ESG itself is a subset of the much broader concept of sustainability. And at the end of the day, managing companies to optimize enterprise value with a view toward the long term is good management. And so getting back to the discussion Aaron was talking about, it may very well be that over time, better managed companies, i.e. companies that are focused on sustainability, will be more profitable over time. But of course, that takes time to sort out. In the meantime, he's absolutely right. The markets are efficient. And if there's overpricing in one area, it will change. But that's one of the things that we really need to remind Republicans of, is the need for diversity among market participants, right? We've been criticizing Democrats since Dodd-Frank of trying to shove everybody into a one-size-fits-all model. And we should not be doing that now that it's a different set of issues. At the end of the day, diversity and competition, innovation and transparency are what makes our capital markets work. And I think if investors are requiring information, that's going to continue no matter what the regulators do, and as I've said in past discussions, in my view, the regulators are playing catch up. They are not driving the discussion. Investors are doing that.
Aaron, I saw you shaking your hand your head there a couple times. Do you want to jump in here?
All in agreement. I mean, I think that's, yeah. I don't think I can articulate that better. So.
Okay. So one more from the audience. This is from Garrett. What about the argument from the GOP that ESG puts an undue burden on small businesses? Anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, I think that's true of the corporate disclosure regime that we have generally, right? And that's why Congress, including Congressman Huizenga, have led discussions on Jobs Act 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. It's trying to find ways to generate capital formation for smaller publicly traded companies as well as privately traded companies that are differently situated and are not in a position to comply with the full SEC disclosure regime as if they were ExxonMobil.
Great. Well, thank you all so very much. This was really a great conversation. I know our audience really appreciated hearing from all three of you. Thank you all. Appreciate you taking the time with us today, and you can continue to learn more about these issues on our website. And again, if you want to, you can look at Aaron, Dan, and Bob's bios in a little bit more detail on our website as well. So thank you. Thank all three of you, and I hope everyone has a lovely holiday season.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.